It was a night staged for effect, floodlights slicing through Tehran's winter haze, a square crowded with flags, placards, and the roar of a sanctioned fury. What unfolded beneath those lights was equal parts pageantry and provocation. Two of Iran's most advanced missile systems hauled into the public eye, displayed not as museum pieces, but as living instruments of deterrence. State television fed the spectacle to millions. Crowd chanted, cameras fixed on sleek metal and notations that folded technical claims into symbolic messages. The optics were unmistakable, a government broadcasting capability and resolve at a moment when diplomacy sat on a knife edge. Those who organized the event knew precisely what a public unveiling does. It dramatizes reach, it wires together technical detail and national narrative, and it sends a clear line to those watching abroad. Washington and Tel Aviv were not incidental audiences. They were the intended ones. Iran's official account drew a direct con. Next in between the hardware on display and the politics spinning around it, a reminder from Iran's point of view that deterrence is more than doctrine, it is theater. At the center of the parade was a missile known in state broadcasts as the Khorramshahr-4, often referenced by its battlefield epithet, K-bar. The government described it as a liquid-fueled, medium-range ballistic missile with an assessed operational reach of roughly 2,000 kilometers, a range that places a large swath of the region within striking distance. Liquid propellants, military analysts note, require more preparation and handling than solid fuel, but they can allow for heavier payloads. That trade-off appears intentional, a design choice favoring mass and impact at the expense of rapid launch agility. State outlets and commanders went further in their characterizations, edging toward claims of advanced maneuver and terminal speed. Those are the sort of technical assertions that, even when disputed by outs, ID analysts carry weight on the ground inside Iran. They reinforce the impression of a military that has not been broken by months of conflict, but rather one that continues to develop and parade capabilities that matter to the country's adversaries. Alongside the Khorramshahr-4, other systems were placed prominently, their names spoken in the official commentary, their silhouettes captioned for television audiences. The Revolutionary Guard's presence was unmistakable, not just the weapons, but the rhetoric, the placards praising senior commanders, and the staged humility of a populace rallied into evening demonstrations. Officials urged turnout, framing the gatherings as proof of national unity, while in practice crowding out voices of dissent after dark. The message was twofold: strength for those who might contemplate attack, and a public posture of cohesion for those at home. Interwoven with the hardware was a more subtle thread: energy. One image from the display showed a lay-bee, referencing Rasgas, a Qatari liquefied natural gas firm, an odd pointed detail that threaded the conflict back into the region's vital energy arteries. It was a reminder that any military escalation here would not only redraw front lines, but also ripple through oil and gas markets, touching distant economies that depend on the flow of hydrocarbons across a narrow, exposed theater. That threat was explicit in the words attributed to commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They warned Gulf neighbors that any use of their territory to launch attacks on Iran would invite sweeping disruption to oil production across the Middle East. The language was calibrated to be read by logistics planners and trading floors as much as by foreign ministries. Interfere with Iranian security and the lights that run global commerce could dim. Timing amplified the warning for could dim. Timing amplified the warning. The parade unfolded hours before a diplomatic deadline, and the choreography tied theater to strategy, a public demonstration meant to harden Tehran's negotiating hand while also reminding the world how far the situation could spread. This was less about the momentary thrill of military display and more about broadcasting a limit. Any escalation, Tehran warned, would not be confined to a single border or a single carrier. It would touch the arteries of energy and security across the region. That posture collided with American resolve in a way that produced almost immediately a recalibration of dangerous choices. President Donald Trump stepped into a high-stakes middle ground and announced a temporary extension of a ceasefire that many had feared would end abruptly. He framed the decision as conditional and tactical, crediting urgent diplomatic outreach from Pakistan's leadership for helping to hold immediate military action at bay. In his account, the pause was designed to allow Iran time to present a coherent proposal for talks. In return, the U.S. would remain ready to act if diplomacy failed, He said the ceasefire will remain in place until Iran's leaders present a coherent proposal and discussions are concluded. He also said he had instructed U.S. forces to maintain a blockade on Iran while remaining prepared for further action if talks fail. Those were words meant to straddle pressure and restraint. A pause, but not a withdrawal. An opening, but one guarded by a naval perimeter that, in the president's telling, would be sustained until Tehran offered a credible negotiating position. The Pakistani intervention, by all accounts, was decisive in the sequence that followed. Field Marshal Syed Azam Munir, Pakistan's powerful chief of army staff, had moved to mediate between Tehran and Washington, and his role, alongside that of Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, was publicly framed as the linchpin for short-term de-escalation. Diplomacy here was not led by distant capitals alone. It was being brokered in real time by regional actors whose leverage is derived as much from geography as from influence. For its part, Iran's response was immediate and uncompromising in tone. The foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, rejected the notion that the naval blockade could be treated as anything other than an act of aggression. He branded the blockade an act of war and vowed what officials called fierce resistance. Those words were matched by action. Iranian media reported a controlled resumption of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, even as U.S. forces continued to enforce restrictions on vessels with ties to Iranian ports. The distinction matters. A complete shutdown of the strait would be an act of denial. Regulation and selective permission are a different kind of leverage altogether, one that allows Tehran to argue it is protecting movement while demonstrating control. The Strait of Hormuz has long been the world's most volatile maritime choke point. A fraction of global oil transits this narrow corridor. Disruptions here are felt in real time at pumps and the balance sheets of import-dependent nations. Iran's declared ability to regulate passage rather than merely deny it turns the strait into a bargaining chip. Allowing traffic under terms set in Tehran changes the negotiation from a blunt closure to a more nuanced exercise of influence. Who moves when and under what conditions? That is a subtler, more sustainable form of pressure precisely because it can be calibrated. Those calibrations can be unpredictable. The transcript of events shows that after an initial declaration of complete control earlier in the crisis, Iran briefly eased restrictions during a window of ceasefire signals and then reimposed them again in mid-April, explicitly linking access to the lifting of the USAT. Naval blockade. During periods of tight control, confrontations have occurred. 2 vessels, reports say, were attacked when they tried to cross the strait during the blockade. Each such incident adds layers of risk for mariners, for insurers, and for fragile diplomacy that rests on a limited number of concessions. On the diplomatic front, Pakistan's role is worth underscoring. Its delegation, a pairing of civilian leadership and the army chief who commands significant respect at home and abroad, engaged in shuttle diplomacy that pushed both sides to step back, however briefly, from the edge. That outreach illustrates an important point about modern crisis management. It is rarely a bilateral negotiation. Regional players with direct stakes and credible lines into both capitals can sometimes make progress where distant powers cannot. Whether those gains hold will depend on follow-through and on whether Tehran can harness enough internal coherence to deliver the proposals President Trump said he needs to see. That last point is the fulcrum of the pause. The United States framed the extension as contingent on Iran presenting a unified negotiating position. Washington also signaled that the naval blockade would remain in place, a message meant to preserve leverage while buying time. Tehran, for its part, portrayed the blockade as an intolerable provocation and responded by tightening other levers of influence, from missile demonstrations to selective control of maritime traffic. The interplay creates a classic security dilemma. Publicly escalating to signal credibly that one cannot be coerced invites punitive measures designed to compel change. Those punitive measures, in turn, can push the other side to signal even greater readiness. Between display and deterrence, the risk is that both sides will interpret the other signals in the worst possible light. Beyond the capitals now wrangling over wording and timelines, there is a larger, quieter cost, the normalization of spectacle. When states routinely parlay domestic rallies and televised parades into messaging aimed at foreign audiences, the space for quiet diplomacy shrinks. Every public arc of steel becomes not only a message to adversaries, but also a stage where domestic politics and international bargaining play out simultaneously. That makes private back-channel breakthroughs harder to achieve and raises the chances that a misread or a misfire will escalate faster than leaders can pause it. For global markets, the calculus is immediate. Even the hint of longer-term disruptions in the Gulf sends traders into hedging mode. Insurance premiums for ships can spike, shipping routes can be rethought, and the cost of transporting oil and liquefied natural gas can jump in ways that ripple across industrial supply chains. The presence of a label referencing a Qatari LNG firm on a missile display was not mere theater. It was a reminder of how intertwined energy, diplomacy, and force have become in this crisis. There are other, less visible stakes as well. Regional neighbors are being asked to choose or to tilt, to permit basing or to deny access, to close ports or to keep them open, choices that can realign alliances and entangle states. In conflicts not of their making, for Gulf monarchies whose economies are tightly bound to oil and whose security calculated, the warnings about disruptions to production are not theoretical, they are immediate, existential concerns. For European and Asian importers, the question is whether a temporary pause in hostilities becomes a longer-term pattern of instability that raises the cost of doing business. In this fraught moment, three dynamics will determine whether the ceasefire extension holds and whether the region steps back from confrontation. First, coherence in Tehran. Can Iran's political and military leadership translate public rhetoric and military posturing into a single credible negotiating package? Second, pressure and patience in Washington. Will the United States maintain enough restraint to give diplomacy a real chance while preserving credible deterrence? And third, the role of regional intermediaries. Can actors like Pakistan and others, who still command lines into both sides, deliver the breathing room necessary for constructive talks? None of this reduces the human cost. Every missile paraded in the public squares, for many, a reminder of lives lost, of communities displaced, and of a conflict that has already exacted a heavy toll. The spectacle of steel and rhetoric may be designed to deter, but it also hardens narratives of victimhood and revenge, making reconciliation harder. For now, the ceasefire extension is exactly what officials in both capitals say it is: a temporary pause defined by conditions and guarded by a blockade. The stakes are wide: regional stability, global energy flows, and the lives of civilians caught between political calculation and the hard arc of weaponry, the military displays, the televised warnings, the diplomatic shuttle between Islamabad, Tehran, and Washington. Each is a piece of the same tense puzzle. This is a story written in weapons and words, where optics meet ordnance, and where, for the moment, diplomacy is running against a clock. Those who are watching, from ministries and stock exchanges to families who remember the last time a regional crisis shook their lives, will be measuring each public gesture for signs of escalation or compromise. In the end, whether this pause becomes the first step toward a negotiated reduction of violence or simply the interlude before a more dangerous chapter will depend on choices that are still being made behind the scenes, even as parades march under the glare of floodlights.